Okay, see how there we go, it says Q. I'll speak about the research we've undertaken second year in a row now for the FTTX Council Africa about fiber deployments in various African markets, and just a summary of the summary presentation of the report that we put together, which will be distributed to council members subsequently. And you, Anita, can correct me or negate this, I suppose. Okay, thumbs up. Good, at least one thumb up. So we initially undertook the research in 2013. We spent a year researching, intensely analyzing data. We concluded there was no fiber. Then we undertook the same process in 2019, and 9 months later we ascertained there is fiber. When I see you again in 2025, there will be more fiber. So it's a certainty. So fiber markets in Africa started a few years ago, and even pre-2014, when we saw the launch of the first, let's say, non-incumbent or independent networks without government involvement in South Africa. But even prior to that, incumbents in some markets have been deploying fiber, mainly for their own purposes and to some mobile sites for backhaul, as 4G began to be introduced, but also to some corporates. But the real wave started a lot later, and probably over the past few years, we've started more and more, seeing more and more fiber being put in the ground, some of it in the air. So last year we looked at 7 markets in Africa, or 6 plus Mauritius. Mauritius is kind enough to supply us with data on an annual basis, and they're the real model success case in Africa, I suppose, given the circumstances. And this year we looked at a few more countries. We did most of them. We undertook some level of primary research with the operators and regulatory authorities in countries, and we also went through a secondary research exercise to follow up on some of the countries we did last year that have not shown as maybe as much growth as we thought they may be showing over a period of 1 year. And we ended up with 10 countries that we looked at in more closely this year in sub-Saharan Africa. And the countries we choose based effectively on our view of the size of the market, potential growth of these markets going into the future, and the significance of the countries within certain regions or the geographic regions. And we try to distribute it across East, West, and Southern Africa. So there's a list of countries there. 2 in West Africa, well, depending how you count it, 2, 3 in East Africa, and the rest in Southern Africa, but also including Madagascar and Mauritius. And then we also do some analysis to draw comparisons between the countries and where Africa is placed globally as far as broadband penetration goes, broadband deployment, and also fiber deployment. Photo opportunity, thank you. If we look at Africa itself, it's still very much, and we didn't supply magnifying glasses or binoculars, anything of that nature, but you will get the report, so you're more than welcome to contact us with any queries you may have. Africa continues to be very much a mobile-driven market, which we all know, and the two bars in the upper left-hand corner chart, or the 2 sets of columns, denote fixed line environment in Africa, and the 2 on the right-hand side, the mobile environment. You can see the stark difference when we looked at fixed line penetration of households versus mobile SIM card penetration of population, and also fixed broadband, effectively DSL, fiber, and also increasingly fixed wireless access, LTE-A, for instance, the fixed LTE-A flavor becoming more and more popular across different markets. So if we look at the fixed broadband penetration environment versus mobile broadband penetration, also a stark difference. So very much still a mobile continent, and it will continue to be so. But even in the mobile space, we still haven't achieved 100% penetration. And Bora spoke about that earlier in his presentation. If we discount multi-SIM phenomenon present in many markets in Africa still, and often some of it goes towards M2M type or IoT applications now, then the actual unique SIM card penetration of the population is even lower than 80%. But let's say taking all SIMs into account, we're approximately at 83% population penetration in Africa, so we still have some way to go before we get to 100%, but that will happen over the next few years. Not so on the fixed line side, still in its infantile stage and very slow evolution in many markets for a variety of reasons. Anything from affordability, access to finance, disposable income levels, to coverage of fixed technologies extremely limited, predominantly in large urban environments, and also government policies to extent, which are changing now. A lot of governments are beginning to develop policies and implement them to build up mobile penetration, fixed line, rather broadband penetration in general. A lot of it still mobile, but increasingly focusing on fixed, which is critical, especially when we look at government institutions such as schools, for instance, government offices delivering civil services to citizens, etc. And as we move into future technologies to solve our problems, healthcare services, for instance, some financial services delivered over the telecommunications infrastructure. If we look at, and there isn't, I think the subsequent slide has a better portrayal of the actual FTTH dispersion across African jurisdictions, different countries. But if we look at the map on the right, effectively shows the broadband environment in Africa and includes both fixed and mobile broadband network deployments and availability of those networks in different countries. So there are a few that still remain a bit of an enigma, particularly those where we see ongoing conflict, which often military conflict, which makes deployment of infrastructure very difficult. And there's no good data coming out of those markets. But by and large, Africa, almost in its totality, has some form of broadband technologies available across all markets. If we look at individual, again, still focusing on Africa, and concentration of broadband across individual markets, in the upper left-hand corner we have FTTH, fiber to the home, fiber to the business connections, and effectively a handful of markets, less than a dozen markets, accounts for the bulk of those connections in Africa. And South Africa, not surprisingly, is leading the pack. But closely after that, we've got Mauritius, a very small island with a very focused strategy of driving fiber deployment and fiber-based services. And they've effectively achieved replacement of copper infrastructure with fiber and replacement of copper-based broadband services with fiber services, moving towards the objective of having 100% household penetration and also in turn business with fiber services and fiber connectivity. So that island is pretty much fully fiberized and is going to be fully fiber-based as far as connectivity and services go within the next couple of years. We also have La Réunion, another small island close to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean basin. Also easier from a geographic perspective to deploy fiber and very successful in moving towards providing fiber to a large proportion of the households, but behind Mauritius. They don't quite have that strategy. Suppose France, since the Department of France is preoccupied with other things like battling Trump maybe in France itself, so defocusing from pushing fiber deployment in a little island in the southwest corner of the Indian Ocean. But East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania account for that. We also have a few countries in North Africa, which really isn't the focus of FTTX Council Africa, that's more into the Middle East geography. But they are, in North Africa, some of the larger FTTH penetrated markets within the African continent. And then the bottom graphic is everybody else in Africa that has fiber, and the long tail with very low penetration levels of fiber deployments and fiber usage, fiber connectivity, active to households and businesses. The map on the right-hand side, all the green blobs, all the countries colored in green, have fiber networks, and the yellow, what's looking sort of beige on the map here, where fiber is being deployed, fiber infrastructure. So those services, commercial services, will be live in the near future during the course of this year into next year. And we've got about 120 FTTH networks in Africa that are commercially active and offer services. Another probably 5 to 6 networks being deployed currently during the course of 2019. And then if we look at 4G infrastructure, almost 170 networks that are commercially active. So a lot of 4G deployment has been taking place, but not quite like fiber, but again, very limited to commercial areas. And the constraint is either business case, so unless the government pushes deployment of 4G infrastructure deeper into semi-urban, semi-rural and rural areas, low penetration areas, or low density areas in terms of households and individuals, it's not going to happen. Operators are going to try and focus where the money is and the proved demand is. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the limitation is spectrum, and in South Africa we're experiencing that as well. Spectrum constraints hopefully will be resolved early 2020, sometime when additional spectrum is allocated to operators, both in the private sector and the WOAN that's being construed by the government, and which will probably come into fruition ultimately. So that once that spectrum constraint is alleviated, that would see greater deployment of 4G into geographically into rural areas, and then it's a waiting game in many markets before socioeconomic factors improve over time. Disposable income levels grow, and greater demand is realized in commercial centers out of the main key urban environments for 4G services to be deployed. Fiber, Abram from Frogfoot spoke to us yesterday about rural fiber deployment, not even rural, sort of tier 2 cities and towns fiber deployment. And that's still problematic, even in a more advanced market like South Africa and other African markets, by and large, with small exceptions, are even in a worse position in terms of a viable business case. So there will be a role for all of these broadband technologies side by side, even though they'll continue to compete with each other as we go forward. If we look at Africa in the global context, on the mobile side, there's a slightly better picture, and from a growth perspective versus other markets, an improving picture. So we are catching up to some of the global regions in terms of penetration usage of broadband services. On the fixed line side, still very much at the tail end of penetration indicators, for instance, and the actual rollout of infrastructure. When we speak about mobile broadband, by the way, we effectively lump 3G and 4G together, but we all know that 3G is not true broadband in all instances. Sometimes the throughput rates are still quite low and slow. So technically speaking, yes, it can be considered broadband, but in reality, probably 4G is a truer reflection of broadband and consumption of broadband-based services across African markets. But if we look globally, mobile SIM penetration, all the regions globally in excess of 100%. So effectively, all the population that wants to and is capable of using mobile devices has them. In Africa, we're still a little bit behind, not quite at 100% yet. When we look at mobile broadband, we're roughly at 44% population penetration. Other markets more advanced, but if I look at Middle East, for instance, at about 63%, and Asia Pacific at about 75%. So yes, ahead of us in Africa, but we're catching up. Unfortunately, on the fixed line side, very far behind, and will be a slow process in trying to move up more into the global rankings, as we'll see on one of the successive slides in terms of country rankings. If we look at Africa from an FTTH deployment and connectivity perspective, connected houses, businesses, we still constitute about 0.2% of total connections globally. So bulk of them in Asia Pacific region, about 512 million. Europe, also a large component, 65 million. North America, South America, both moving towards 20 million in these markets, but in Africa at about less than 1.5 million, maybe about 1.5 million now connections across the continent. So still the privileged few have fiber, not increasingly the masses. What is enabling the fiber usage, the demand for fiber, but also sort of a constraint in a sense, is evolution of backhaul infrastructure in Africa itself. And from a connectivity perspective, and Bora mentioned that we've got quite a few cables with a lot of capacity and increasing capacity. We've got more cables that are, at least on paper, being earmarked to be built, connecting Africa to the world. Some of them may not necessarily happen, but surprisingly, as we think there is enough capacity, enough cables, there's always somebody comes up with a business case for yet another cable, whether it's commercial or strategic, and yet more capacity goes into the ocean's bottom. And now we see the big OTT guys, Google building a cable, and Facebook also starting to make overtures about building its own cable around Africa, circumnavigating Africa. So we're now seeing OTTs putting their infrastructure between Africa and other global regions, and what that will likely lead to is increasingly greater fall in prices of international capacity. So that's no longer a constraint, will become even less a constraint in the future. And that's all at a time when we actually need probably less and less international capacity, because a lot of the content that we consume in Africa is now being dumped on the shores of Africa and hosted here in data centers that are growing up all over the place. So South Africa first, we're starting to see content being cached in places like Nigeria and Kenya, increasing with time. Likes of Microsoft, Google, AWS will have their edge data centers, edge nodes also set up in those regional markets, and will be caching more content more readily accessible. The constraint is still in some places on inland, on the backhaul, the national links, national long-haul infrastructure, in some places metro infrastructure, particularly once we're out of the big metros into secondary towns, and also in the access environment, and that's where I think the critical development needs to take place. South Africa, we're seeing less and less of that. We've got quite a bit of broadband infrastructure going in the metros and the larger urban centers. If we look at mobile broadband, even more so, but there are markets across Africa, especially the more impoverished markets, where that infrastructure is very limited. If we look at African country rankings within the global ranking of the countries that show the best performance in use of fiber connectivity, we now have 4 countries, including one in North Africa, Tunisia, that have made it into those rankings. And in order to qualify, you need to have at least 200,000 households in the country market. So Mauritius just qualifies, and lucky them. And you need to have at least 1% household penetration in connectivity. Not much. I mean, arguably that's a very low indicator, but even with that, only South Africa, Mauritius, La Réunion and Tunisia have been able to make it into global rankings. Picture will change in time, but that's where it's at the moment. So it just shows that we're really at the bottom of the pile globally still. but that does present an opportunity in terms of future growth. For infrastructure operators, FNOs that will be deploying infrastructure, and also consequently service providers. Right, so next section is an overview of the 10 markets that we focused on, and then some concluding remarks. And if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask. We don't necessarily need to dwell on at length on all the countries. But Angola is a bit of an enigma. They have, it's been one of those somewhat closed markets that has begun to open up, not as bad as Ethiopia, but it is a key economic hub between Southern and West Africa, and they're trying to position themselves as a gateway to Africa in competition to South Africa, and in geographically they're actually better positioned. But unfortunately, because of the historically the political environment and the regulatory environment, policy environment, and just the resultant telecommunications market structure hasn't been very conducive to extensive growth in that market, particularly when it comes to fixed line services. So growth is taking place. I think it has been slow, partially due to slowing economic development in Angola. They used to grow at double-digit rates when oil was pumping, and there was greater demand for resources. When oil was at $100 a barrel, they've slowed down since then, and effectively they need to develop also a new pragmatic economic strategy going forward in order to unlock economic potential and development, and also growth in household consumption. Part of the problem is also high retail cost of services in Angola when it comes to telecommunications, and that translates into lower demand. People just don't want to spend that type of money, often don't have the type of money to buy a fixed line connection, broadband connection of good quality. So as of mid-2019, approximately 17,000 connections, and growing at a sort of a steady but relatively slow rate at this point in time. And it's effectively a market dominated by TV Cabo and Angola Telecom as the two infrastructure providers in this space. Ghana is one of the upcoming markets in West Africa. It looked like it was growing a bit faster than we would grow faster than we or that we hoped it would grow faster. What the reality is, it also a market that faces some constraints. So it's been moving into the fiber environment. Again, has showed a slowdown over the past couple of years. And in fact, one of the operators that was about to start deploying fiber is yet to execute on that strategy. So that has slowed down uptake of services. Just the rollout of infrastructure is not quite as fast as was anticipated last year. About 21,500 live connections in that market. Kenya, if we move to the eastern coast of Africa, is one of the actually good growth markets. A few years ago, they were starting off, had a very slow start. They have subsequently started to see faster uptake of services. Some of the drivers are gated communities. Also, there are developments around smart cities. That's still also in early stages when it comes to putting in proper broadband infrastructure, but it is something that is going to drive that market when we effectively start seeing these smart cities materialize around the Nairobi area, and we see greater investment in gated communities and deployment of fiber infrastructure into those. Some of that infrastructure leaves a bit to be desired, but so you hope there are no strong hurricanes coming through that will blow down the poles and terminate the services. But there is growing appetite. There is healthy competition emerging and also resultant decrease in prices, which is driving demand for the services. So good growth in double digits, strong growth, coming off a relatively low base, but now it's actually beginning to gain momentum, and also driven by Kenya's economy. So as that economy and Tanzania's economy continues hopefully to grow over the next few years, it will form a solid base for increasing household wealth and desire to consume more content, more services locally and globally, and also for businesses to start transforming more into moving into the cloud environment and taking greater advantages of services such as SD-WAN, for instance, as they become adopted over the next 2, 3, 5 years, leading to high demand for fiber services. Madagascar, it's going in alphabetical order. So again, island country, really single operator, the incumbent deploying fiber there, fiber infrastructure, but it has been moving at also ticking at a steady rate. It is one of the poorest countries in Africa, so that uptake is expected to be limited. But again, over time it will grow, and hopefully a couple of the other larger operators in that market, competitors, will also end up deploying their own infrastructure, such as Orange, which has a strategy of infrastructure deployment in many markets, and will foment a healthier retail competitive environment in the market. But again, a lot of these markets are constrained by high retail prices and also wholesale prices, which contribute to higher retail prices. So it's a limited number of households and businesses that can afford and are willing to pay that sort of money for a service that's still that's beginning to offer more than what was offered before, but in some instances the use case for households is not being seen yet, and for the SMEs. So the SMEs are still, especially smaller companies, quite happy to see to just make use of basic internet, as long as they can access the internet, the emails, have basic functionality that's afforded on a half a megabit per second, 1 megabit per second throughput. They will rationalize their spend and not necessarily commit more funds to buying a better service, fiber-based service, just because it's there. Mauritius, we mentioned that it's the most successful market in Africa when it comes to connectivity rate and actual deployment of fiber across the island. It is a small geographic environment. That's one of the big attributes, that you can cover an island like that, and all the residential areas around the island, around the edges of the island, on the seaboard, with relatively low capex. But having said that, it needs to be also looked at in relation to revenues for Mauritius Telecom. And also very successful in driving connectivity, effectively taking an active strategy in replacing copper connections with fiber connections to households, and driving home the message, so to speak, of the benefits of fiber in terms of socio-economic development, educational development, and also for leisure purposes. And it's being heard, and households are realizing that it does deliver value and benefits, and businesses increasingly are also moving in that direction. So by 2020, Mauritius Telecom has an objective of effectively having achieved 100% household penetration with fiber. Whether that will happen, we shall see. And that's from a penetration perspective an ambitious target for any market, because ultimately not all households actually do want fiber, even if they have it on their doorstep. Mozambique, our South African neighbor to the east, again, a slow market, in growth terms, a decent market, but a slow market in terms of absolute numbers of fiber deployment. And again, a market that's, I think, just emerging into the broadband environment, so we expect to see stronger growth in the coming years, but at the moment still operators that do offer fiber need to build a strong use case and I think do a lot of education of the business market and also high-end residential market for fiber to be accepted. And would be the incumbent operator would drive a strategy of replacement of copper with fiber, but the number of copper connections is quite low, DSL connections. So even though once you've replaced all of them with fiber, you're still at a very low penetration level. You need to put a lot of effort into driving that adoption within the residential and the business market. Nigeria, also a market that's it's a bit of a disappointing market in a sense. There's a lot of activity in Nigeria from the government side, regulatory side, and private sector side, predominantly in the mobile space, and also fixed wireless. And given the size of the country and of the business market, one would expect a lot more development having taken place as far as FTTH is concerned. But I think it's finally beginning to show some movement and sort of starting to kick into higher gear. And again, part of it is related to a depressed economy and slow economic growth. So, growth rates have been around 3%, sometimes lower over the past few years, 3% annually of GDP, whereas the country should be growing at least 6% in order to accommodate the large population growth and actually start growing off a fairly low base of GDP per capita. And that ties back into the national strategy of diversification away from oil revenues and building home industries and for domestic market and export purposes in time. So that takes time. And I think Nigerian government should have woken up maybe 10 or 15 years ago to the need to start diversifying strongly and quickly. It took them a bit of time before they decided, yes, it's going to be a good strategy. I think they realized it at a time when oil went below $40 a barrel. They thought, might be a good idea, maybe not to stake our future on oil exclusively. So it's happening, but again, slowly, and there are other factors that inhibit faster fiber infrastructure deployment, including let's say on the regulatory or bureaucracy, maybe bureaucracy side is better. Number of way leaves you have to arrange and contend with if you want to build in an urban environment, from local authority to municipal authority to state authorities. You may have to get a few way leaves in place before you're even able to start digging the trenches for your fiber or putting up poles for aerial. And then you have local thugs, the area boys that may damage your fiber, so the cost of vandalism may become quite high, and consequently it also translates into high cost of services still, which then limits demand, both even in the high-end residential environment and the business environment. But there is more investment that we're seeing going into residential areas, gated communities, for instance, so beginning to see more high-rise apartment residential development. So with that investment, there will be more greenfields opportunity to provide fiber as part of that infrastructure. That's one of the drivers. Another driver, I think, in time, ultimately will be the government's view and the efforts of trying to push fiber penetration as one of the broadband strategies and broadband in general, and eventually get the strategy right of deploying infracos across all the different geopolitical regions in Nigeria as the underlying infrastructure required for backhaul of data traffic from residential and business market. And content, increasing development of content and demand for content, local content and also international content. And also I think as some of the large OTTs put a lot of their content into local data centers over the next couple of years, decreasing latencies, making it easier to access that content, making it maybe a bit less expensive, that will also begin to feed into greater demand for that content and for the services. So we remain hopeful that Nigeria will actually start growing at a faster pace and see faster deployment of absolute numbers of fiber infrastructure going forward. South Africa, the biggest market on the continent. So around the middle of this year, we were sitting at around 640,000 connected homes and businesses in South Africa. As we've heard over the past couple of days, the objective is to try to connect a lot more houses and a lot more businesses. The focus on business environment has been lower than on the residential environment to date, just because everybody was trying to go after the upper middle income, higher LSM households in South Africa and pursuing the so-called land grab. Now that it's beginning to taper off and we're looking at proof of concepts of successful business plans, business cases to go into lower LSM geographic areas, some companies are beginning to refocus on the business, and that comes hand in hand with emergence of new technologies such as SD-WAN, which are also beginning to be adopted, but again in the really an early adoption phase, even introductory phase in the country at the moment. But over the next 2 to 5 years, there will be greater uptake, and that will drive demand for fiber. Moving into the cloud environment, another big driver that we anticipate in the business environment, to a lesser extent in the household as well. So it's not improbable that we're going to see a lot more fiber being deployed once we're able to target those additional 5 to 6 million households that currently are off the radar for most FNOs in the country. And once backhaul becomes even cheaper and backhaul networks move closer to the secondary towns, then deployment in those towns will become more economically viable. But having said that, still a very strong market. We see the large FNOs still rolling out like crazy, passing houses and businesses, and also being quite successful at converting those into live connections, live and billable. So when we look at connections, fiber connections on the continent, and in particular in South Africa, we do probably the most research, and we try to work towards a definition of a house passed being a house with a drop-off point. So effectively, you can order your service, and within a few days or a week, you're up and running and live. It's not just fiber going, a meter underground past the front doorstep, but with without a box on the boundary wall. So you still need to obtain a way leave in order to dig a few meters into the gate and then actually pull that fiber through to the front door of the house once the service is ordered. And that could be anywhere from a month to a few months, depending on the operator. So we try to standardize when we do research on the definition of a home passed and a business passed. Tanzania, another market in East Africa. So beginning to trail closely Kenya in terms of its evolution, quite a bit smaller than Kenya, maybe half the size, a bit less than half the size in terms of number of connections, even though it's got a larger population, a smaller, less sophisticated business environment, and that accounts for lower uptake of fiber, so a poorer society in general. So you have the smaller upper middle class or high-end residential market that is able to afford fiber services, and also a less sophisticated business market. But it is showing signs of growth. So it's one of those markets that's, I think, going to start moving and quicker in the direction of fiber adoption to a greater extent. And also a market with one of the higher connectivity rates based on deployed fiber. So result of companies pursuing strategy of more targeted deployment into the high-end affluent areas and concentrated commercial centers, and then really selling the fiber as a good solution. And in many of these markets in Africa, there's a dearth of historical copper infrastructure, and what little is there often is not necessarily viable for good broadband services. So it's an easier sell for fiber. Effectively, it's the fixed wireline solution competing against a number of wireless solutions. But if you really want the best of the best, then you don't have a choice of ADSL, maybe at a lower rate, lower cost to you as a consumer. You buy the fiber service, and that often results in higher conversion rates and connectivity rates on the infrastructure built. And Zimbabwe, last of the markets that we've looked at, again, we thought last time round that it was really the phoenix starting to rise from the ashes, and the political environment looked like it was moving in the right direction. Over the past year, I think everyone's sort of hopes have been slightly deflated, or a lot deflated, depending on your experience and outlook and worldview. And we see the economy taking one knock after another, and that really translates into a slower growth environment in the fiber space than what we would anticipate a year ago, 18 months ago. So there has been initial growth, quite a bit of initial deployment of fiber infrastructure in the key urban centers, not as much uptake. So I think the affordability of those services is really constrained, and probably at the moment becoming increasingly so. And until such time as we really see, I think, serious economic reforms and a lot of foreign investment coming into the country to grow the economy, and that also is tied into, I think, the political attitude in Zimbabwe itself, in the government, then unfortunately remain a sort of a wobbling phoenix that is trying to rise from the ashes. But hopefully next few years we'll see a significant change in the country coming through. Some conclusions, maybe predominantly on what are the market challenges and market opportunities. So if you look at challenges, I think one of the big challenges is still the high cost of deployment on the one hand. The cost still often anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 a house or a home passed, or a business passed with fiber infrastructure. That translates into high wholesale prices as operators want to recoup the investment as fast as possible, and ultimately into high retail prices, and that really constrains limits the affordability, constrains the demand for fiber-based services, fiber connectivity. It is changing. So on the one hand, the costs are coming down, often gradually. On the other hand, a lot of these markets of higher growth, like Kenya and Tanzania, the affordability is increasing. So households, businesses are able to afford those services more and more every year, and that drives the demand. Low levels of addressable market, or small addressable markets in many of these markets in countries in Africa. So the middle class is effectively small, and it's not growing as fast as we thought it would grow 5 to 10 years ago, where we thought the middle class would just skyrocket across Africa. But it's taking its time to grow at a much slower pace than what economists thought and what marketers thought, and that constrains the addressable market given the current retail pricing structures. Bureaucratic red tape, we spoke about it in the context of Nigeria, but it's not only limited to Nigeria. So that effectively that can be looked at from two aspects. One is the actual ability to cut through the red tape when you want to roll out infrastructure. The other is more at the national strategic level, developing the right policies, right legislation based on policies, and the right regulatory environment thereafter to enable broadband deployment, and within that fiber infrastructure deployment. And I think when we speak about that, we can also mention open access networks, open access infrastructure, which at the moment is an inhibitor and a challenge. It's also a future opportunity as we hopefully will move more towards that environment. So in South Africa, we know we've embraced open access through the independent FNOs fully, and just about all the networks except one or two on open access when it comes to access fiber. You don't let everybody in, but you vet the ISPs, and a lot of the FNOs have 30, 40, 50 ISPs and more on the networks offering retail services. Not so in Africa. It's just the beginnings. In most instances, if you want to offer fiber services, you build your own fiber network. That's obviously expensive. Not everybody's got access to that sort of funding, and it limits competition. It drives infrastructure-based competition a little bit, but it really limits the retail competition which is needed to drive market demand through better customer service and lower prices, and in general better quality services that you're going to offer. As a result of that, at least in theory, unless your contention ratio is going to be 1 to 50 because you want to maximize your profit as an ISP. So open access is important, and just as much as infrastructure competition is important, we need to use open access to drive retail competition to a greater extent. And that once we get to that phase, I think a lot of these markets will follow what's happening in South Africa on a growth trajectory. Maybe not at the same high growth levels, but certainly in that general direction, we'll see an improvement. 5G networks and 4G networks now, to an extent, present a challenge and a constraint. You often, with current 4G technology, fixed wireless access, you deploy it a lot quicker, it's price competitive, the quality of service is good. You don't necessarily experience the same problems as actually fiber may in some of these markets through frequent cuts. So your fiber service may be good, but it gets cut once a month for a couple of days, and then you're out of a service. 4G isn't necessarily subjected to that sort of unintended destruction, or sometimes outright vandalism. So it is a very competitive service, and it fills a very good gap in the market. So it's more difficult for fiber to compete. As 5G services emerge, which is still anywhere from few to several years down the line, depending on the market, 5G will probably play more of a complementary role, because 4G would have already established a certain territory. 5G will effectively start moving into that space occupied by 4G, but also will require a lot more fiber for front haul and back haul. So ultimately, it is going to drive fiber deployment to a greater extent. And then, I think fragmented fiber access infrastructure environment in many of these markets. So partially related to the open access, in fact, maybe quite strongly related to the open access discussion, where you have a lot of small operators, and because they provide their own infrastructure, if they want to provide retail services on fiber, they end up building small pieces of the network in the urban centers, because that's how much they can afford to build. They can only access so much funding because they are small to begin with. So unless you're an MTN or a large provider that can throw money at it, and this is just another sort of technology and another access to your customers, to a certain group of customers, certain market segment. If you're a small operator, you're always going to be very constrained on how much you can roll out over what period of time. And if there is no greater unification in terms of infrastructure, pulling resources together, then we will see small operators competing, which is not good for the market from a infrastructure deployment and service quality provision. That translates into a number of opportunities. So lack of legacy infrastructure presents an opportunity for fiber. No copper. Fiber is a very good service that is coming in the place where copper would have been, but it is competing with the wireless broadband, fixed wireless services. More open access is driven through regulation also, as we see a number of governments in Africa now thinking about building infracos, whether they are national or regional. Places like Nigeria having already started to implement that, putting it into that plan into fruition, with stumbling along the way. granted, but I think it is going to enable, from a backhaul perspective, development of the access infrastructure, and ultimately also that will translate into an open access infrastructure itself, so in the access network, in the last mile. Middle class migration to gated communities. As the middle class grows, and it will grow and continue to grow, we see more and more migration into cities, and within cities they often prefer to go into some sort of a gated community or more dense environment, which makes it more economically viable to deploy infrastructure in a more densified residential area. And I think in general, socio-economic growth, evolution that we're going to witness, and in parallel also government emphasis on e-government services. So the government looking for enablement of services that it delivers, or the private sector in some instances delivers, through telecommunications, broadband infrastructure, and through that intended strategy of e-government services that will drive greater deployment and penetration. So I think quite a few opportunities to look forward to, but from a timeline perspective, they're not all going to happen next year. It is going to be a gradual process of evolution rather than a revolution, I think. So we've got a few years, a year to 2 years, to plan and pre-position ourselves, and then we hopefully will, within the next 3 years and onwards, start seeing increasing growth that we can take advantage of as part of this industry, from an infrastructure provider's perspective and services provision perspective. So that's, I think, the conclusion of the report for 2019. As indicated, the council will distribute the report to all its members, so you can go through it on the weekend as you fly back on your plane, etc. And then we're more than happy to interact with you on any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.